And maybe now, with the peace plan that his own negotiators worked on, that he has talked to President Zelensky about, and then that is still rejected by Vladimir Putin, maybe that'll be the trigger finally to get to that point.
President Zelensky is on his way to Florida for talks with President Trump on the efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Zelensky said the latest version of the 20-point peace plan is 90% ready, but the US president said Zelensky doesn't have anything until I approve it, so we'll see what he's got. Well, this comes after a fresh wave of Russian airstrikes in Kyiv overnight, with at least 2 confirmed dead and 20 people injured. A third of Ukraine's capital has been left without power after a night of relentless Russian bombardment. Let's talk to Kira Rudik, leader of the opposition Holos Party in Ukraine. Good afternoon to you, Kira.
Hello, Carolyn. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, good to have you with us. And first of all, I know that you're speaking to us from Kyiv. It must have been a really terrifying night last night.
It was indeed. It felt like Armageddon because the explosions, the sound of drones, attempt to take those drones down, the missiles that were hitting the targets. It's just so terrifying. Sometimes you do not believe that it is real. But unfortunately, it is real. And right now, we have at least 2 people killed and at least 30 people injured. And where I am right now, we just started having electricity an hour ago, and we still do not have running water and heat. And so this same thing is happening to many people throughout Kyiv, for at least 4 million people city. So it doesn't seem as a fact that will prove that Putin is ready for peace, right?
Although, do you think it could be perhaps President Putin just keeping up the pressure as we go into this latest round of peace talks?
Unfortunately, that could be an attempt of Russia to break us down and to break people's morale, but it never worked and it will not work this time. Again, Russia has tried to weaponize winter and to weaponize darkness for the last 4 years, and they were never successful. They are successful in destroying our energy infrastructure, but not in putting the pressure on people to say, okay, we want to give up. I didn't hear anyone saying that they want to give up. And today, believe me, there are so many people trying to help each other and provide the heating, help with the water, etc.
And of course, this comes. Sorry to interrupt you, Kira, but of course, this comes ahead of those crucial talks in Florida. President Zelensky on his way there as we speak. Are you optimistic that there can be a solution found to bring the war to an end? President Zelensky seems to be talking up the extent of agreement on a 20-point plan, but both President Trump and President Putin seem to be rather more cautious.
Let's make it very clear. The 20-point framework that President Zelensky has worked together with European partners and with the inner circle of President Trump is not something new to President Trump, and it's not something that we know that Russia will take as is. The goal, again, is first to show once again that Ukraine is the side that wants peace most of all. There were a couple of attempts by this new administration to say that Ukraine is standing on the way of peace. Well, we are not. And this is why President Zelensky is going to Mar-a-Lago right now to again ensure that we are interested in peace and we are trying to find a solution. The issue is that the United States needs to execute on the threats that they have been making to Russia to pressure them into peace. This famous peace through strength that President Trump promised, because otherwise there will be no deal. Otherwise, Russia will be just dragging the negotiations on. So the hope is that finally, after Putin fooling him for so many times, President Trump will lose his patience and go ahead with putting a real pressure on Russia.
One of the crucial sticking points has been this question of territory, in particular the Donbass. President Putin has been continually laying claim to the whole of that region. Do you think we have reached a point now where Ukraine is at least prepared to accept Russian control over large chunks of its territory?
Well, there is a reality on the ground, but we will not put it in any of our documents, and we will make sure that it is not the Ukrainian territorial integrity is changed. But let me ask you this, Carol. Russia has added 4 of our regions to its constitutions. Some of the regions that they control like a very little piece of, some of them are mostly controlled. Even if there was in some parallel reality an agreement about Donbass in particular, what would happen with the remaining 3 regions? Is Russia going to remove it from its constitution? What is the plan there? And I do not think that there is any sort of plan. And this is why the attempt to take this legal control is yet another trick by Russia to fixate their territorial gains in some legal documents, to show the world that in 21st centuries, borders can be changed by force.
Kira Rudik, leader of the opposition Holos Party in Ukraine, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I do hope that 2026 brings some peace for you and your citizens. Thank you. Well, let's bring in the former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. Kurt, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Great to be with you, Carl.
Really good to have you with us. President Zelensky meeting President Trump tomorrow, whereas President Zelensky seems to have been talking up the level of agreement. Very different signals are coming from President Trump and President Putin. How close do you think we are to an agreement?
Well, it depends what you mean by agreement. If we're talking about getting the U.S. and Ukraine and Europe aligned around a reasonable plan for peace, I think we are getting closer to that. I think the 28-point plan from a few weeks ago, that was just a Russian blueprint. That was a disaster. But since then, negotiators from the U.S., Ukraine, and Europe have all worked on this and turned it into something that is much more reasonable. And we saw some snippets of this in the Kyiv Independent this week, even though it has not been fully released in public. I think if we can get that alignment with the West and Ukraine together, that's a very good step. There is absolutely no chance that Vladimir Putin is going to agree to anything reasonable. He's going to insist on everything and more. He wants all of the territory of all the provinces that they claim to have annexed. He wants to change the Ukrainian government. He wants to demilitarize Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to be perpetually neutral and out of the European Union. He wants no security guarantees for Ukraine, and on and on and on. So that is just a non-starter for the U.S., Europe, Ukraine. It's never going to happen. So what we'll end up with here is some degree of agreement with Ukraine, the U.S., and Europe, disagreement with Russia, and then having to go through the steps, as Kira was just saying, of strengthening Ukraine politically, economically, militarily, because we're going to have this long-term standoff with Russia for a very long time.
And you've run through some of those demands from President Putin. I mean, they are the same demands that the Kremlin has been making right since the beginning of this war. Isn't the key decision now what President Trump does? Because he's made these threats, hasn't he, time and again, that he's going to ratchet up the pressure on President Putin, that he's going to stand up to him. But then that hasn't happened yet. Are you detecting any change in that attitude?
A little, but not a lot. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how this goes on Sunday in Mar-a-Lago and what comes after that. But we've had President Trump apply sanctions on Russian oil, Rosneft and Lukoil. We've seen a few other areas of tightening of sanctions. We could do a lot more on sanctions. We could do secondary sanctions on those who are evading them. We could go after the shadow fleet. We could also provide greater certainty about arms supplies for Ukraine going forward, even if they're paid for by Europeans or by frozen Russian assets or by the Ukrainians themselves or even by a lend-lease arrangement where we lend the money to Ukraine so they can buy American weapons, but providing greater certainty there and lifting restrictions. Right now, we still apply some restrictions on the long-range use of American weapons. I think those could be lifted. So there are more things that we could do. And as you say, President Trump has talked about tough measures on Russia quite a lot, but he's never actually followed through. And maybe now, with the peace plan that his own negotiators worked on, that he has talked to President Zelensky about, and then that is still rejected by Vladimir Putin, maybe that'll be the trigger finally to get to that point.
And we know that President Zelensky has been speaking today to senior European leaders, talking to Ursula von der Leyen, President Macron, and others. But the Europeans seem to be really struggling to make their voices heard in all of this, because President Trump so often simply dismisses their stance. And of course, everyone will remember that extraordinary showdown in the Oval Office. Do you think there is still a risk that this meeting tomorrow between President Trump and President Zelensky could go really badly if, depending on the President Trump's mood, depending on how President Zelensky plays it?
Right. Well, you can never rule out a meeting going badly. It's always possible. But I do think that since that meeting you're referring to back in February of early 25, I think that there's been a lot of progress between the U.S. and Ukraine, even though we have difficult moments from time to time. Back then, you'll remember, President Trump said he was not convinced that President Zelensky really wanted peace. He was afraid that if the U.S. continued to provide support for Ukraine, Ukraine would use that to continue the war. That argument and that perception now has completely changed. We now have a U.S.-Ukraine deal on an investment fund. There's formerly a minerals deal that is now much broader. We have both sides, the U.S. and Ukraine, wanting an immediate ceasefire. Only Vladimir Putin rejects that. We now have a draft peace plan that U.S. and Ukrainian negotiators have worked on. And as we know, it is not final. It is not 100% agreed, but there's a lot of progress. And I think there will be more progress this weekend. Even President Trump said yesterday he thought this would be a good meeting. So I think we are in a different place now than we were back in February. I'm more optimistic about this being a good meeting and one that brings the U.S., Ukraine, and Europe even closer in alignment than we had been up till now.
But just briefly, if you could, Kurt, I mean, doesn't Ukraine have to accept, if not Russia actually having sovereign control over part of its territory, then some kind of de facto acceptance that parts of Ukraine will remain under Russian control, that it will have to in some way or form sacrifice some of its territory?
Right. I think when you put it as de facto accepting that there is some Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory, it's currently about 20% of Ukrainian territory, accepting that they're not going to get that back militarily. That, yes, that I think is in the works. Something President Zelensky talked about even a year ago, accepting that there's some Ukrainian territory that's occupied, recognizing it as part of Russia, that it is legitimate that Russia controls this territory and that it is part of the Russian Federation. As Kira just told you as well, that's something Ukraine is not prepared to do. No Ukrainian leader could agree to that. Okay. If it goes to the Rada or if it goes to a referendum, no one would ever agree to that. It becomes a de facto situation, but certainly not something that's recognized. Very similar to what we had in Germany, very similar to what we still have in North and South Korea.
Okay. Well, look, we'll have to leave it there, but it's been fascinating to get your thoughts. Former US Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, thank you so much.